Now, though it be the Protestant religion here mentioned, yet it holds equally and more so good to Presbyterian, as Prelatics are no less excluded by our solemn league and covenant, etc., than Papists are. We have now given dissenters' explication or sense of this section. Let us take a glance at our modern loyalists' gloss of it. Now, if this is to be understood in an unlimited sense of all religions, all times, all places, situations, and circumstances whatsoever, then paganism, Mohammedanism, popery, and the profession of these cannot exclude one from having a just right entitled to rule and govern in these covenanted lands more than that of prelacy. And this not only pulls down and saps the fountain of all our national attainments on this head, making our reformers at one stroke cut the neck of the covenanted constitution, which they had with so much blood and treasure obtained, but even condemns the practices of almost every kingdom and established commonwealth in the world, for it makes them run cross and contradict themselves in all the following particulars. Number 1, to all those qualifications and conditions of government formerly noticed. Number 2, to the coronation oath of Scotland, which obliges king and people to be of the same true Reformed religion. Number 3, to the national covenants and all articles of the solemn league, wherein they had sworn to extirpate and root out popery, prelacy, etc. Number 4, to the 3rd section of the same 23rd chapter concerning the magistrate's power in the matters of religion. Number 5, to a number of the best human acts and laws that ever passed in Scotland, or any nation else, particularly these in the year 1649. Number 6, to the condition of government, which Charles II was admitted to at Scone, 1651. In fine, it is a certain truth that both parliaments were at open war, refusing to admit Charles I to his full power, or regal dignity, till he became of the same religion, and gave security and swore the covenants, when they compiled the confession. Nay, the succession to the crown was limited the same day in Parliament, that the confession was approved and ratified. And yet say that in this article they held that one of any religion or profession might be accounted a lawful magistrate over a covenanted people, professing one thing and practicing another, is what none, in the use of reason, could have accounted for such a piece of conduct. Again, this vague gloss not only makes our venerable reformers who compiled our confession at variance with themselves in principle and practice, but also flies in the face of almost the practice of all nations. We need not speak of England's security on this head, alas. We feel it by experience. But go over to the Low Countries, and see if Holland will admit of Papist magistrates, and Germany of a Protestant emperor. Take a turn to Constantinople, Morocco, and China, and see if they will consent to set up a Christian for supreme ruler over them. Turn the globe to America, and wide as their sentiments on religion are, try if you can make them elect and establish a pagan or Jew for a magistrate. Return the way of France, Spain, and Portugal, and you will find whether any of them has ever established a Protestant Presbyterian king to reign over them. The conclusion then must be that, as our objectors have said, that our explanation makes the Westminster divines to have compiled a confession for the other side of the globe, while it is evident it will answer any side or part of it, while it's as evident that their gloss seems palpable or palatable to no side or part of the globe whatever, unless it answers the Cape of Good Hope, where no certain form of government exists. Objection number 4. Quote, our covenanters swore allegiance in the covenants to Charles I, while of a different religion, and bound to maintain prelacy. If these covenants had bound him and their posterity to disown every king that was not of the same religion and a covenanter, they would have been bonds of iniquity. They could not bind to anything but to what they were bound to by the law of God prior to their covenanting, unquote. So the loyalists say. In answer to this, for order, take the last part of the objection first, where it may be observed, number 1, the point here is so far periodical and caseable, as it applies to certain times and situations. The Lord never requires any piece of duty at his people's hands, but what he some way or other puts it in their power to perform. When the children of Israel were in their own land, and had it in their power, then they behooved to set up such rulers as the divine law did prescribe. But when gone to captivity, then they behooved to submit to the powers there for a time, were it even for wrath's sake. The end is declared by the prophet Jeremiah and the apostle Paul, quote, for in the peace thereof ye shall have peace. that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, etc. Unquote. So was the case with our reformers in a Christian reforming land. As soon as the Lord brought them that length, putting it in their power and capacity to make such a choice, and for that purpose enact good laws, and enter into covenant engagements to have such and no other, and this only brings under super obligations, yet bound them to no new moral duty, but what they were by the law of God bound to prior to this super obligation, had they been put in a capacity to obtain a performance thereof, and that this was their views, may come to be ascertained from their own judgment and practice, before I leave the objection. Number 2. For the other part of the objection, of swearing to a prelatic king, as they call him, might it be inquired, how it comes that, when our Covenanters did so, and their practice must be thus cast into the teeth of dissenters? What is the reason that the objectors refuse to swear allegiance to him whom they call one of the best of kings? Such a piece of conduct is scarce reconcilable. But to the point that Charles I was a prelatic, and sworn to maintain episcopacy, is granted. But that they took in his interest on that head, or swore allegiance to him on any terms but in defense and preservation of the true religion, is an assertion yet unproven. Notwithstanding of all the follies of inconclusive reasoning and perverting quotations that has been produced upon it, for how they could be said to swear allegiance to a prelatic king while professing and defending episcopacy in such an unlimited sense, and at the same time swear to extirpate prelacy and malignants, of whom he was the chief, must be a paradox and not, that they have never yet by the sword of the Spirit boasted, been able to cut asunder. But let the Covenanters' principles and practices on this point speak for themselves. Mr. Case, one of the Westminster divines, when answering an objection on this article, says, quote, "It maintains him as far as he is a king. He may be a man, but sure no king, without the list and verge of religion and laws, it being religion and laws that makes him a king. For sure his justice cannot desire to be defended against, but in the preservation of religion and laws, and his wisdom cannot expect it. I make it a question whether this limitation lie any more upon the defense of the king's person and authority than it doth upon the rights and privileges of Parliament, and the liberties of the kingdoms, since there is no point or step in the article," unquote, etc. And here a footnote. That from Case's second sermon at Taking the Covenant. To the same purpose speaks Mr. Ward in his explanation of the Solemn League, quote, "We promise, saith he, to endeavor to preserve his Majesty's person and authority, that is, so long as he really endeavors the preservation and defense of the true religion and liberties of the kingdom," etc., unquote. And here a footnote. Vide Ward's explanation of the Covenant, page 4. Not to stand on particular persons, let us hear the united voice of the whole body of Covenanters by the mouth of their representatives. Says the Commission of the General Assembly in their advice to the Parliament June 10, 1648, quote, "There shall be no engagement for restoring his Majesty to one of his houses with safety, before security be had from his Majesty by solemn oath, under his hand and seal, that he shall for himself and his posterity agree and consent to the acts of Parliament, enjoining the League and Covenant, and fully establishing church government," etc., unquote. This they corroborated in another paper same year, December 17th, and adds, quote, "We are bound by our covenant to defend the king's person and authority in defense and preservation of the true religion," etc. "And insofar as his Majesty is for these, so far will we be for him. But if his Majesty will not satisfy the just desires of the people, both nations are engaged to pursue the ends thereof against all impediments," unquote. And so the General Assembly, in their seasonable warning of July 1649, says, quote, "The duty of defending and preserving the King's Majesty's person and authority is joined with and subordinate unto the duty of preserving and defending the true religion and liberties of the kingdom, and therefore his Majesty's standing in opposition to the just and necessary public desires concerning religion and liberties, it were a manifest breach of covenant, and a preferring the King's interest to the interest of Jesus Christ, to bring him to the exercise of his royal power," unquote. Take only one proof more from their declaration, July 1648, when expatiating on the violation of the second article of the Solemn League, quote, "Neither, say they, can we conceive how the clause concerning the extirpation of prelacy can consist with the endeavoring to bring his Majesty with honor, freedom, and safety to one of his houses in or about London, without any security had from him for the abolition of prelacy," unquote. Thus far the Church, the same resolutions was put in practice by the state, the resolutions of a committee of the Parliament of Scotland, and some of the ministers, according to Mr. Bailey, were these, quote, "We require peremptorily to stand to our former principles and covenant, to have religion settled first, and the king not restored till he had given security by his oath to consent to an act of Parliament for enjoining the covenant in all his dominions, and settling religion according to the covenant," etc., unquote. Here, footnote. Vide Bailey's Letter, Volume 2, page 281. Which resolution was put in execution by the English Parliament in their Treaty of September 1648 with the king, where, after craving the abolition of prelacy and establishment of presbytery, they demanded, says Justinian, that the king should set his hand to the national and solemn league and covenant, and suffer himself to be bound by the same, unquote. Here a footnote. History of the Civil Wars of Great Britain, page 264. Upon his refusal, the treaty broke up, and he was refused an readmission to the regal government, and so our sufferers understood it, when treating on the article, and our covenanters, quote, "Because, say they, by the covenant they were not obliged to defend him, and only in defense of religion and liberty, by which they were not so stupidly loyal as some would have them," etc. Here a footnote. Hind let loose, page 69. To the same purpose spoke the gentleman martyr Raphaelite in answer to the capitious question, quote, "That question was answered long ago by the solemn league and covenant, which binds us only to maintain and defend the king in defense of the true religion," unquote. All which comes out full evidences for dissenters, in which it may be seen we have another precedent than the words of Oliver Cromwell. And though we had not, I presume, that whatever his personal character in government was, he knew to a certainty what the judgment and practice of our covenanters was, as well as any man now in Britain. But what says Mr. Rennick in his large testimony on it? Quote, "We answer that article is only conditional, binding us no other way to him than in defense of the true religion, etc., as it is therein express terms," unquote. Now, what is this but what was said by Oliver Cromwell? Objection 5. Quote, "The Jews were commanded to obey and pray for these Chaldean powers who carried them captive. The primitive church was 300 years subject to the Roman emperors. Our ancestors were subject to the authority of James VI, Charles I, and Charles II, till he turned a tyrant." In answer to this, let it first be premised that these are examples only, and exemplum, explodatur, exemplis, ex simple, serve for illustrating, and no more for proving than agreeable to precept, preceptus non exemplis standum. Nor did they ever dream that their practices should on any other terms be accounted an unerring rule to posterity. But in examining these instances, let it be observed that this instance of the Jews' subjection in Babylon in Jeremiah 29 was not positive moral precept of obedience perpetually binding at all, but only temporary for the space of 70 years. And here a footnote. See G on Magistracy, page 138. Until the time of the punishment of their sins were fulfilled or accomplished. This is making God dispense with his own unalterable law, says the reviewer. But to take it as you will, he that said, quote, "Seek the peace of the city, and pray unto the Lord for it," unquote. The reason is given, quote, "For in the peace thereof ye shall have peace," unquote, which implies no positive subjection at all. Said also, "Set yourselves in array against them, flee out of the midst of Babylon." Quote, "Happy shall he be that rewardeth thee, as thou hast saved us," unquote. Now, which of these will the objectors choose for the precept of their loyalty? Number 2. For the primitive Christians, the proof of the assertion is mostly, if not all, negative. They lived peaceably. They gave no molestation to the kingdom or commonwealth where they resided. They were sometimes permitted to meet for public worship in the day. Well, what of all that? They were so enjoined by the apostle to lead a quiet and peaceable life, and so dissenters look on it as their duty under the present reigns. But although it were proven that they owned those heathen powers, what makes that the argument is lost, for the case is vastly different. These lands were not reformed. There was no relation betwixt them but what was natural, which the gospel did not lose, nor sinful conditions require upon their enjoying places of trust under them, if they enjoyed any. Otherwise they would never have accepted of them, which is not the case with us, when the Constitution, after reformed, is overturned, and none can enjoy places of power and trust without debauching their consciences with sinful land-defiling oaths, or concurring with the superstitious idolatries of the Church of England. Nay, the loyalist fully determines the point betwixt us. Quote, "The rule to direct Christians how to choose a king, and the rule to direct them how to behave towards one chosen by others are very different. When they have the choice of a king, the command of God is, quote, "One from amongst thy brethren shalt thou set over thee," unquote. But when God appoints the bounds of their habitation, where they cannot have a king of their own religion, like Israel in the land of the Chaldeans, or the first Christians in the Roman Empire, then the divine command is, quote, "Let every soul be subject to higher powers," unquote, etc. Here a footnote. That from the Modern Loyalist, page 34. Which must equally hold good with us in covenanted Scotland, and these Christians and Protestants interspersed in heathen and popish countries.